Hey there friends, Dave Paulides, CanAm Missing Project, copyrighted edition for our video channel. Thanks for being here. And this is a missing person segment, and we're going to cover two missing people. But it's not a normal missing person segment. In the past we've talked a lot about dreams. We're going to talk about them today in a context that I can't even imagine. When I was writing these up, it hit me pretty hard. Because sometimes I put myself in the position of the parents. And it made me think. Our DNA, which is our fingerprint, individual fingerprint amongst us that identifies us as different than everybody else. And when we have children, the woman supplies the egg, the man supplies the sperm, and that child is a composition of both. It's only just in the past several decades that we've figured out DNA. And somebody came up to me the other day and said, "Hey Dave, you have great videos. Here's a question for you about your dream segments. What if our DNA is much more complex than we even think it is today? There's an obvious physical side to the DNA between ourselves and our kids. But what if there's something within that DNA that ties in emotion? Even animals. Even animals show great emotion over losing one of their own. And obviously, we as people do too. But what if our DNA is somehow linked to an emotion that we haven't identified? We talk about our third eye, and it's stated that it calcifies over time and we lose that ability to psychically connect. I think that could be true. But what happens if there's a great anxiety moment to your son or daughter? And you hear stories about, well, I know at that moment something hit me as well. And I later found out that my son or daughter died then, or my mom died, or something genetically tied to us happened. What if there is that link and we just haven't found it? And what if there's some type of psychic connection that we don't understand? Because while we're not physically in the presence of our son, daughter, mom, dad, but we still sense something. How can that be possible unless there is something there? So you guys are good thinkers. Our world is much more complex than we think. And that bond between us genetically has to be more complex. It has to be. I'm going to tell you two stories today. They're dream-related stories. And at the end of each one, I'll talk to you about it. And I want you to think really hard about what transpired. In past segments, we've talked about parents not being the one to find their child that was lost, and why maybe it doesn't go to the parent. Well, now I'm going to throw a wrench into that. Here we go. Alice Mathers went missing June 9th, 1963. She was 12 years old. And her family lived on the outskirts of Mission, British Columbia. I was in that town for the filming of the UFO Connection. And I was all over that area for 2 weeks. Beautiful. It still is beautiful. It's about 30 miles east of Vancouver. It's much more populated than it was in 63, but still a lot of open ground there. A lot of real thick forest just north of there. Well, on June 9th, Alice had gone to visit her married sister that lived about 1.5 miles away. She was coming home, and she had borrowed some cooking utensil kind of thing, that, like a mixer, from her sister, because she wanted to come home and bake something. So she's holding this and she's coming home. She doesn't make it home. And her dad immediately drives a route back to the sister's house, doesn't see her, gets family members, friends involved, and soon the police are involved. RCMP's there. Massive search. And most of the search was centered on the woods on the north end of the home, and the route that she would have been taking. Now, Vancouver would be over here. Abbotsford, British Columbia is here. This is the US-Canadian border. Cultus Lake. This is the Fraser River. This is Duroche, and this is Mission. Her family lived on the outskirts of Mission. And I'll explain the attachment here in a second. Again, this area is beautiful. It still is. Well, the RCMP brought in a couple of canines, and one of them tracked Alice's scent from outside of her sister's home, just down the street, to the Lafitte Highway. And that would be Highway 7. Nobody thought much of that, but it stopped right at the highway. And they continued to search for 4 days. At the end of the third day, they put another dog on it. And now the second dog does the same thing. Now you've got something unusual. When a small child scent trail ends at a roadway, you got to think somebody picked her up. 12 years old. Well, parents are devastated. The article's just, it was horrible reading it. Each time I've met a parent that has lost a child, it's as though their life would never be the same. They're a changed person. And Mr. Mathers couldn't stop searching. Every day he went up into the mountains looking. He couldn't believe that someone would pick up his daughter. He thought that she went up into the mountains for some reason. He just kept going and going and couldn't stop. I understand that behavior. Probably what I would have done, because I would have felt worthless staying home. Well, this went on for a long time. Finally, the search and rescue gives up. Mr. Mathers, every day after work, went out. Then on June 23rd, Mr. and Mrs. Mathers go to sleep. In the middle of the night, Mrs. Mathers has a dream. She dreams that her daughter is in a gully, almost like a pit. And her daughter is deceased, laying on a rock. And it was a vivid dream. Later that day, she tells her husband what she saw. And she says, I can't get it out of my head. I see Alice. I'm not sure where this is at, but it's somewhere around here. We got to go find it. Well, the Mathers hadn't been there for decades. And they thought about it, and they knew a man that had lived his whole life in the area. His name was Roy Creighton. So they contact Roy, and they explain what Mrs. Mathers saw. And Roy goes, hey, I'm all in. I'll help you guys any way I want. There's a couple places I know of. They're about 12 miles from your house, but they're not that far from the highway either, so let's go check them out. Well, they drove down the Lafitte Highway. They came to an area about 12 miles from their home, and there looked like there was this giant pit on the side of the road. So they drive into the pit, a gravel pit, and Mr. Creighton gets out, and he goes, I'll go this way around a narrow section, and you drive around the other way where it's wider for a car, and we'll meet at the other end. Well, they walk down to, Mr. Creighton walks down the end and finds Alice laying on a rock in the back side of the pit, kind of away from everybody could see. He thought it was her. He didn't know, because her face was so badly beaten you couldn't tell who it was. But he brought the Mathers over, explained what the site looked like. And they immediately identified her by what she was wearing. And she'd gotten new shoes 2 days earlier, and she was still wearing them. They called the police. Police came out. And there was a set of tire tracks going into this area that was narrow and hard to get into. They took some casts and they worked it as a crime scene, just like they should. So in the past, many have stated that the message of that dream goes out to someone on the periphery, not a family member. Well, think about this, because I did. Alice was female. She's coming home from her sister's home. Obviously a genetic tie. Who's a female? And then she's en route to her home, where there's more genetic ties, her mom and dad. Now her sister doesn't have the dream. Her mom has the dream. There was no speaking in the dream. It was just a vision. So a question I have for you. We all have a soul. I believe that 100%. So do all souls, it's another belief Dave believes, a soul stays alive through eternity. Can that soul move on if their remains aren't found? Of the remains of what they occupied here on earth. Is that the reason that the message is sent? So they can move on? Now that obvious mother-daughter bond is eternal. Is that the reason that the mom got the message? But we've also talked about others getting the message. It was 13 days from the time Alice vanished till the message was relayed. Is there significance in that 13 days? Why wasn't she told 3 or 4 days after? Then I thought, if you're going to give Mrs. Mathers the vision of her daughter laying there, why not give her the vision of the killer's face? I mean, that would kind of wrap everything up. And I know sometimes mediums, psychics, whatever you want to call them, demons that some of you call them, they get the face of the killer. But not this time. So that's the Alice Mathers case. Now some of you are going to say, well, what happened? Well, police did a great job. They ended up tracking down that car. It belonged to a man that was 30 years old. They went down, they interviewed him, brought him in, matched the tires, found forensic evidence in the car, ended up convicting him and his younger brother. The owner of the car was convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to death in BC back then. And his brother was convicted of rape with Alice. Made big headlines in BC. Okay, the next case is even more unworldly to me. Really bizarre. Involves a young man named George Roberts, 18 years old. Went missing September 26, 1927. The Roberts family owned a farm on the outskirts of Romeo, Michigan, north of Detroit. In case you guys didn't know, here's Romeo, here's Detroit. Not a lot of complication there. Now, George, on September 26, 1927, everybody got up to do their chores. Midday, everyone's looking for George. Can't find him. His dad starts looking. Checks the farm. George misses lunch. Never does that. Misses dinner. Never does that. He knew something serious was really wrong. He got other people, other farms in the area to help him. And they search, and they search, and they search. After 4 days, they got nothing. George had never been away from home before for this long. A day or two visiting friends, but never like this, 4 days. And never without telling his family where he was going. Now, what's interesting about this, from the best I can tell, it was just George and his dad that lived at the property with some help from some other people to work the fields. But in the family, it appeared to be just George and his dad. His dad's name was Charles. Charles had been up almost nonstop since George disappeared, and on September 30th, he was exhausted. He crawls into bed. And about 3:30 in the morning, he wakes up with this vivid dream. The dream told him that George was in a big hospital in Detroit. George thought about it all day as he woke up, worked the fields, tried to discount it, didn't think much about it. October 1st, Charles again went to sleep. Same time he always did. This time in the middle of the night, he again had a vision of his son at a big hospital in Detroit. He had no idea where it was, other than it had to be Detroit. He'd never seen the hospital before, but he had a vision of what it was. But he still wasn't sure what to believe. He wasn't sure to believe his dream. And I suppose he didn't want to think that his son was in the hospital, because his son was a pretty healthy guy. So think about, you're in this position and you've never heard of me and you've never heard of dreams, finding people, and where'd you go? 2 nights in a row you've had this dream. Well, Charles doesn't believe himself, doesn't trust himself that much. October 3rd, it's a Monday. Charles had the exact same dream for a 3rd night. This one did it. He knew he had to go to Detroit and find this large hospital. I'm researching this, and then I'm reading this, and I'm trying to put myself in Charles' position. 1927, people weren't that advanced back then. Not everybody had a car. Travel was difficult. And if you were a farmer, and you were a simple man, going in and having conversations with a hospital and trying to impart on them what you had in this dream without being laughed at, might have been a hard thing to do. Well, on October 5th, Charles finally makes his way, after talking to many people, to the biggest hospital in Detroit. And he looked at it and he said, this has got to be it. It's got to be. Nothing was quite the same at this hospital compared to other hospitals. It was huge for 1927. So he comes into the middle of the hospital and he goes to the front desk and he explains that he's looking for a son. And they said, well, let me check the name. Well, the name is George Roberts. He's 18 years old. Person checks and they have nobody in the hospital. And there's no computers back then. It's all by cards and paper. And the lady says, I've been here for many months. I don't remember anybody coming in by that name either. And I think I might have remembered. It's almost like 2 first names and I just don't remember that. And she said, but I really hate to tell you this, that the one other place you might want to check is our morgue. And we are the city morgue for the entire city of Detroit. And we have somebody there all the time, so you could go down there and talk to him. And she said, I know that we have many unidentified bodies there. So I can just imagine what Charles is thinking. Oh boy, this isn't the answer I wanted, but I've got to go. So Charles goes down to the basement and he meets with a staff member at the morgue. He explains who he's looking for, and the man goes, okay, let me check. Half an hour later he comes back and he goes, I checked everything for the last month. We don't have anybody under that name. And he said, there's really only one person we've had in the last month that comes close to that, and it's an unidentified 18-year-old boy named Kirby. And Charles goes, well, that's not my son's name, but can you describe him? And the morgue attendant explains the physical appearance, and it's like George. So Charles says, hey, would you do me a huge favor? Would you please go back and look through his personal belongings and see if you can find anything that relates to Romeo, or maybe a different name or something? Man goes, yeah, I could do that. And he said, I think I should tell you that this boy came in several days ago with bad stomach issues. He died, and under an autopsy they found he had poison in him. But let me go see what I can find. And he leaves the room. Charles's mind is just going every which direction it can, trying to figure out, could this be his son? And could it not be his son? And another 30 minutes comes by. This is the part that just chokes me up. morgue attendant comes into the room. He's clutching something in his hand. He walks over to Mr. Roberts. With a very solemn look on his face. Doesn't say anything. Opens his hand. There's a locket there. A locket that Charles gave to George. It had Charles's picture in it. Charles gave that to George when he was a young boy. He wasn't even sure if George was still carrying it. It was an absolute breakdown moment. Charles had found his son, but not under the conditions he wanted. The attendant couldn't even believe it. The attendant did the paperwork. Told Charles to come back the next day, and they would make the arrangements to release the body to him so he could take him home. Next morning, Charles came down to the hospital, picked up his son, drove him back to Romeo. What I was thinking about, what would that drive have been like? I can't even imagine it. There was a cemetery in Romeo, and Charles buried his son there. So the dream that Charles had pulled him to that hospital. It was Charles' insistence that his son had to be there that got him to the point of that attendant to look at Kirby's personal property. But it was the locket. That brought those two together. I think about weird stuff sometimes. Back 10 years earlier, whenever it was, I don't know, when Charles gave that locket to George, did the spirit realm tell Charles to give that to George because George would need that later in life for this? I don't know. Here are these stories that our life is all mapped out. We really can't change it. Obviously, Charles gave that to George. Pure love. pure love. So it goes back to what I said earlier. Is there some type of, for the lack of a better word, electrical connection that we have because of our genetics being tied together? It sure seems like that. To me it does. But what I don't get is, why doesn't that connection always work? Yeah, I know. Bad wiring. Friends, this world is not the friendliest place at times. And I've actually felt this way the entire day I've been dealing with these two stories. I don't know why. I'm usually in a pretty upbeat mood, and I try to keep myself that way because it's not healthy getting like this. But you guys are family, and you won't hold it against me for telling you how I feel. So in the meantime, thanks for being here. My movies are up on Amazon right now, and you can watch them. We're trying to still get that first movie, Missing 411, up. Hopefully it'll be up before a couple of weeks. I don't know. If you're in the USA, you can watch it on Amazon. And you can get the DVDs for the first movie and the UFO Connection on our website, NA like North America, BigfootSearch.com. I hope this story about the dreams doesn't disappoint some people out there. I think it's a valuable topic that isn't talked about that much. But it does have to do with missing people. At least the ones I'm presenting to you. Maybe not the classic 411 sense. I'll stop rambling. Thanks for being here. Take care. Paulides out.